So Nadia is a professional dance artist and founding artistic director and CEO of Company of Others, a charity and dance theatre organisation which uses movement to create social change. She has collaborated on performance that has been presented nationally and internationally, including Sadler's Well, Biker Community Centre, Tramway Glasgow, Concert House VN, Theatre Royal Newcastle and Summer Theatre Detmold. Her work is created around grassroots organising, co-creation and connecting people with an international focus. So we're not going to hold back much longer. I'm going to now hand you over to Kim and Nadia, who will be doing the in conversation, and we'll then follow through with a Q&A, and we'll also have hopefully some time for you at the end to have go into breakout rooms and have discussions in today's event. So Kim, I'll just hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Tanwin. Hi everyone, lovely to see so many of you here. I'm also very delighted to be joined by Nadia Iftkhar. I thought it might be useful to first of all maybe do a little bit of a background, because Nadia and I know each other and have done for some time. Nadia was actually the one of the artists working with Janice Parker when we did the Commonwealth Games project Glory in 2014, and Nadia was leading all of the movement with the participants, and I was actually a participant in Glory. So I was not working, I was also a co-creator on that programme, and then since then we have worked together in a few different capacities, including as I was a member of your board of directors as well. Yeah. So I'm really, really happy that you're here to talk about your work, which I have followed for some time, and also your practice, and also co-creation and how that shows up. So I'll start maybe just by asking you, Nadia, to expand a little bit on Tanwin's introduction and tell us a bit more about who you are and what your work is.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks for having me as well. Thanks for the invitation. So lovely to be here. I'm in Newcastle currently and from Newcastle, and didn't go perhaps the traditional route through dance, and somehow ended up working internationally a lot and working a lot as a jobbing choreographer. So a lot of travel, a lot of flying into places, making something and leaving, and experiencing a bit of frustration at that, and a little bit of wanting more time, wanting more resource, wanting more, I guess, thought put into frameworks of making, and how we do that, especially given that we work with the body. So I started developing what I didn't know at the time as a co-creation practice, and I guess I created Company of Others as a result of the practice. So the practice really came first, and then it needed a structure to live with, as many do, and I guess a way of really labeling who we are and who we want to be in the world. So I guess I really started developing that practice probably around the time we met, actually, and didn't quite know what it was, just knew that I didn't want to be making work in a hierarchical way. I knew that I didn't want to be on my own, I guess, as well. Like, my favorite parts of making, or, you know, when it's getting and the costume design's there, like the whole team's together and things are really buzzy. And I guess I wanted to find a way to stretch that out a bit and to just have this sense of a making community from start to finish as much as possible. So we're, I think, 6 or 7 years into the company now, and we have our own building now as well, which is really exciting. So that's been an interesting way of thinking about how do you co-create a space, and how do you co-create in a different framework that is actually a lot more rigid as well. So yeah,
I love this expression, a making community. You're kind of creating a community that are making something together, and those different structures that can exist in. So your structures of your company of others, but then also this physical space that you're working in as well. Can you tell us then, so you started to touch on this there, about co-creation maybe starting to emerge for you on that. It was a project called Glory. It was during the Commonwealth Games. It was part of the Commonwealth Cultural Fund programme that was happening in Glasgow for the Commonwealth Games. And I remember there were a bunch of different different people involved. I think there was about 40 of us, if I remember rightly. Yeah, it was quite a large group. But you talked about the seeds of co-creation kind of starting there. Can you talk about a bit more about what that means for you and how it shows up in your work at Company of Others, but also even in your work outside Company of Others?
Yeah, I think around about that time I was doing a lot of, well, my practice was always community engaged and community focused and community based. And I think from a movement perspective, I was always looking for a way in which I was never imposing movement that might feel good on my body or might express what I want to express with my physical self onto somebody else. So even in workshops, choreographing, I would always try and start with the person and how they wanted to move, what their desires were, and start to kind of craft something together with them. So there was a lot of, when I think back now, watching, observing, how are people moving when they feel good, a lot of free movement. You might remember in Glory rehearsals we'll just have a bit of a dance and just let loose. And really, that was fun to do, but I was really doing that so that I could pick up on some things and think about how I might entwine some of that movement into the score that we were creating. And I think that was always a part of my practice. And I started to just pull the thread on that a little bit more. And I think I was also at the time looking for something more in terms of a sense of belonging. How do I find that? How do I create spaces for that? How do I really feel ownership of my work and create a way in which people can of theirs? And I guess I was looking for something a bit more meaningful as well. I think, you know, at the far end of the spectrum, dance is about aesthetics and form and quite elitist. And I think I was resisting that as much as I could.
So this kind of gave you another place to explore dance in a different way, I guess.
Yeah, and I've always thought of movement rather than dance. I love dance and I love the word dance, but I'm very careful where I use that term as well. And I'm interested in all movement, I guess, as an artist. That's what intrigues me. And I think trying to then shift from this very movement-based kind of practice that I didn't know was co-creation, and then thinking of all the different formats that it can live in, the next step of that journey was a work I made called The Sense of an Ending, which was a series of 3 solos in 2014, I think, that was co-created with women in the Northeast. And that was the first kind of step of dip into the toe of how do you co-create a work, a show, a production. And of course it was very flawed and all co-creation practices are, but it was, I really just loved it. I loved the sense of sitting in an audience, watching this work premiere with an audience for the first time, with 80 women that were also there as makers alongside me, and this sense of a shared accomplishment. And I really loved how it shifted who I cared thought about my work and what they thought. Like it really threw that sideways for me, and reviews didn't matter to me anymore, and the opinions of the co-creators were the most important, and it just gave my work a real focus. It's hard, it's exposing, it's vulnerable to make work, and we have reviewers and anybody that, you know, has a right to say something about the work, but that just stopped mattering so much to me. And I kind of started to fall in love with this notion of making things differently. And then each time since, each iteration since has been, I guess, a crafting of that process, and knowing that every time you do it, it's different because you're in a different context, co-creating with different people, the different stages, different everything. And some things you let go of, and some things are threads all the way through the practice. So it's an ongoing journey. That's the thing to say about co-creation.
There was two things you mentioned there, Nadia, I'd love to expand on. You talked about the people, the opinions that you care about now being the co-creators. What do you think it is that they valued about this way of working?
I think a lot, well, there's some things that people tell me that I know, and there's some things that they'll keep to themselves that I'll never know. But I think a lot of the things that people want to tell me is that there's a sense of validation and being heard, a sense of mattering, a sense of something they have to say has a place in the world and a right to be heard. And also it's like horizon opening, you know, like to come into this process that is so shrouded in theatre. I guess it's kept secret because it's all about the show, you know, but we actually tear it right open. And there's also a level of care, I think, about the process that may not find its way in there if it isn't co-created. So people talk a lot about that, about the care and the sensitivity and the importance that is placed on this work.
Yeah, so they're very kind of present, and that validation element, and as you say, that kind of diversity of perspectives coming up in one piece of work is enriching, I would imagine, as well.
And sometimes it's, I mean, there's always, yes, diversity of perspectives, but I think sometimes it's also these things that experiences we have, or things that we think, or stories we want to tell, that we walk around holding on to as if we're the only ones. And I think what happens is, through the process, our co-creators go, oh, hang on a minute, you know, there's a real understanding, I think, particularly around grief as well, and the things that we co-create work about, that you're not the only one. So it kind of just lays that right open. Of course, there are nuances and differences in everyone's story, but we will all experience grief. We will all experience a trauma. So there's, as much as there's absolute diversity of experience there's also a lot of commonality too.
Yeah, and creating that environment where people can find or has been really powerful. And the other question I was going to ask was about what are the consistent things that come up in co-creation, but I wonder if I can put a pin in that and just come back to it shortly. And first of all, ask, what is it about co-creation that makes you want to work this way? So obviously you've kind of touched on the, you know, the ingredients that people can bring into a space just by virtue of them being who they are and their movement and their experiences. But yeah, like what kind of other things is it about co-creation that makes you want to use it so much in company of others? Because it really does feel like such a core practice and process of that organisation.
I think I'm an activist, and I'm desperate for change, particularly in our sector, and I think it's one of the ways in which I can most clearly use my skill sets for that, and contribute to that change in who gets to be heard, who gets to be called a maker, an artist, who gets to sit on stage and do a Q&A, you know, that feels really important to me. I think also this sense of togetherness, you know, I get that out of this process as well. In some ways it's very lonely, but I get to make work with other people, and that is something that I really love. I love how much it challenges my artistry and my skills, because you just have to always be prepared to think differently, so that sense of creativity gets really stretched, and there's something about it being a practice that keeps me in my artistry as well. I don't know how to articulate that any better. Let me just find the words. I think it would be very easy, especially with an art form like dance, to just make something that looks good, that is going to do all the right things for an audience and go, job done. I'm going to keep using that formula to make work and make work and make work. And there is work like that, and I probably love it as well. It's all valid. But there's something in the having to always start from scratch with your process almost, and having to be in practice always. So there's never a process in which you're going to get it all right, and that feels very much linked to artistry as well.
Yeah.
So I really love that about it, and I think I do love that it's changed who I value caring about my work. It's kind of freed me of a lot of things that can be quite unnerving and dismantling about making work. It's very exposing, like I mentioned, and I think it just gives me a real clear focus, and in that a freedom. I'm not even remotely at risk of following trends or, you know, anything like that. So I think those things are really present for me and in the why I do it. And I think it's important that there's a reason, that there are reasons that I want to do it, that I get out of it, because otherwise we end up being in service of and not co-creating with. And I think that's when it changes the dynamic.
And that just makes me think of you can't pour from an empty cup.
Right.
Like if you're not being nurtured and if you're not in this process because you're there's something in it for you as well, it's okay for that to be the case. You know, that's a lot to hold for all those people. Otherwise, you know, why it's as we've touched on before in our conversations, it's not for everyone, not for every artist, and not for every community member or someone who wants to explore their creativity. So it is really important to think about, like, what's nurturing you and what's kind of keeping you sort of in the process and in practice. And I'd love to expand on that, like how, I guess when I think about being in practice, a lot of it comes from mindfulness and awareness and rootedness and groundedness and being kind of like an anchor almost within something where things are happening around. How would you describe being in practice for you when you're thinking about co-creation with people?
It's a really good question. I think definitely a lot of things that you just mentioned. There are some things that I have to be absolutely rooted in throughout the process. And one of those things is, who do I care about, whose opinion matters in the work? That is one of the things that I have to have anchor me. I think there's a lot of journaling, like there's so much reflection on every day, on every task, on every conversation, and a lot of internal questioning. You know, in that moment, was I listening for something that I want to hear? Was I really listening? You know, and I think being prepared to really get it wrong and to be okay with getting it wrong, because it is a practice, and just release any expectations, I guess, of this perfect co-creation process, because it just doesn't exist. I don't know anyone that's found it, and I've got a few friends that are co-creating. It doesn't exist. So I think being honest with yourself about that, and in your own reflections, and making sure everything, for me especially, is documented, every thought process, because we make work over periods of 2, sometimes 3 years. So the next time I'm stepping into a production process, a lot has happened.
Yeah,
I need to be able to go back to that and really like assess, like, what are the things that I want to pull through, what needs to be let go of, and not being precious about that, and not being precious about the work. That's also like a practice, and your opinions of your work that is co-created as well. You may not like the outcome, you know, it might not be the work that you might have made elsewhere. And there's definitely been times I've been like, oh, not quite sure about that, but everybody involved loved it, and I and everybody else was very proud of it, because we prize the process. Like, that's the thing that I want to walk away from feeling really proud of, rather than the product. The product is almost a vehicle for the process somehow.
yeah, it's your target, it's the thing you're aiming for,
Yeah.
but actually it's the how you get there that's
Yeah.
important. I think some of the things you've mentioned there around like a making community, always being prepared to think differently. I love that, actually. I think that's a tool for life. And these cornerstone practices of reflection, documenting, journaling, you know, listening, taking time. How much time would you say you spend on those sorts of things, Nadia? I've never asked you that.
No, and I've never counted, because I probably wouldn't want to. I think also you have to be quite careful that you don't go down a bit of a rabbit hole with it and get in a loop with that too.
Yeah.
And you have to be quite kind to yourself in that as well. I think that's really important, and that is also a practice. I think in the moment, some things go down, and I know that I'm not going to want to look at that for a couple of years. And then some things, I have a little way, like, with, you know, these little stickies that pop out of the end of a book. Like, sometimes I have like a time process, so like yellow will be come back to that in a year, or, you know, because it's all very, very fresh, or blue might be, you're going to need to remember this tomorrow, so that I don't have to go through the reams
The whole thing.
notes. So yeah, and again, that is only something I developed about 2 years ago.
Yeah. So and so it's kind of creating these sort of boundaries and signposts for yourself when you're doing that reflection. I guess I try and set time limits if I'm doing kind of journaling or thinking about, you know, trying to kind of remember or reflect on something that needs reflected on. And we do a lot of that at the Remembering Together network. There's lots of opportunities to come together and exchange ideas and think about what we're doing and how we're doing it. But yeah, I guess the rumination is always possible. So it's trying to have an alarm that says, okay, stop now, go and make a cup of tea.
And you definitely have to be that person for yourself. Definitely. And I think, you know, you touched on something there that's really about care for yourself. And I think I almost go into this, you know, every process knowing that I'm going to let somebody down. You know, that is going to happen. Somebody is going to be disappointed in this process, whether that's because we can't make something happen theatrically or, you know, and you just have to, you have to let yourself off the hook for that little bit, because every artist, whoever makes anything, is disappointed somehow in their own process, and it is part of the process. So I think when I was first starting out on this journey, I didn't have that at the forefront of my mind at all. And now it's part of my own process of care for myself that, you know, people are going to be disappointed, and how you take care of that disappointment and how you mitigate and navigate around it is crucial. But this high expectation that everybody's going to have an incredible time and everybody's going to be really, really thrilled with the process and outcome, it's just not realistic.
Yeah, and I think that's also something that's maybe a source of a little bit of fear or anxiety within this project, because the context is so emotive, because we're talking about, you know, people who are processing their experiences of loss and change, or who are celebrating some of the gains, you know, the things that they benefited from during lockdowns and during this ongoing pandemic. There is a sense that we want it to be absolutely perfect for everybody, but, you know, I think you're totally right, it can't be. And there's also something in the way that we handle that disappointment in the moment with the people that we're working with and with ourselves. And as you say, that kind of thing about being validated, being heard, being present, being within and part of is a big, you know, thing that co-creation can offer. But it might not necessarily be what people expect or you know, thought they were going to be doing. Thinking about, I'm actually, you know, I'd love to share something about when we did the Commonwealth Games project, the Glory project with Janice Parker. And I remember I had come to that because I'm disabled, and I had had some real difficulties I kind of accepting that, and I was quite sort of disconnected from my body at the time. It was giving me a lot of pain. It was not really doing what I wanted it to, and I was also masking. I was hiding the fact that I was disabled from a lot of people, certainly in a work context. And I remember doing Glory and finding it really hard. And I don't remember ever being disappointed, but I do remember thinking, this is not what I expected. And I've told you and I've told Janice since that it had a really profound effect on me being part of that project, because it was the first time I had to share how I move most authentically around other people. And to use like a chair to complete some of the movement, or to move in a slightly different way, or to take more rests, or to pace and things like that. So the feeling of what you expect and what you experience being slightly different, but also still being incredibly powerful and transformative, even just to kind of I remember having a conversation with you and Janice about how much I was struggling, and you saying, you know, there are other people with other stories here, and just because they weren't as obvious didn't mean that they weren't happening. And I've since found, you know, other connections with people that were part of that group and understood that a bit more. But that leads me on to the question about, you know, you do tend to work a lot with underserved communities, people who have been excluded. What do you think about in particular when you're co-creating with diverse groups of people or people who share some kind of excluding experience or something like that?
I think about all the ways in which I need to be listening, showing up. I think a lot about how power might affect the process. So I think about how much power is possible to share, what powers aren't possible to share, which powers I want to share as an artist, and how do I do that whilst retaining my power as a neurodiverse working class woman of colour as well. I think I have to really keep in my mind present that I'm a co-creator, and I think in any co-creation, in any deep collaborative process like that, there is this give and take and fluidity that happens as well. So try not to be judgmental of that, but keeping my eye on it, making sure it doesn't go too far either way. I think about which parts of my lived experience can be in the room and which parts can't, and where some of my lived experience might be held by somebody else and shared with someone else as well, and what care I need to instill for myself and them around that. I really try and get to the crux of what is important for them as early on as possible, and quite often there's a story and then there's a story. So it may be that people come with something they want to share and they want to make into a work, and often that's not the actual thing that they really want to share, and there's some sanding down of that thing to get into the very nugget of it gently. And I think also, and this is where my responsibility as an artist really lies, is I have to think about how much they are protected in that process from outside influences that I can't control. There have been times when our work has been being introduced, for instance, in a season launch process, and some of our co-creators were there, and they were called women who have suffered. And
that's probably not the language they would have chosen for themselves, right?
No, certainly not. And I felt it in my stomach, and you know, we're in this theatre setting, and I had just come out of that theatre and, you know, just get to those women as soon as I could, and to talk about it, and to talk about how there are power imbalances that go beyond our process and what they mean. So I think in somebody sharing their experience or co-creating a work with you, there is a level of knowledge that you have that they don't, and that can be about how cruel reviews can be, or it can be about that if it's an outdoor work, for instance, people might just walk away. It doesn't mean that they don't love the work, that they might have to go and pick their kid up, you know. And so I think there's things that we have as artists that is tough, and you know, but where we know it and it's familiar. So I think it's a lot of the hidden things that I really want to prepare other people for, that might impact them differently, I guess. And I also always want to be sure that they're really prepared to share, because I think sometimes people might want to share in that moment but knowing and making sure that they deeply know that they can remove their consent at any time is really important. And knowing that cognitively and then feeling that are two very different things. So there's always a lot of work around that. So anyone we work with can change the work right up until premiere night for that evening show. Or sorry, my dogs just start snoring.
That's okay. Hi, Bo.
Hi, Bo. And if it's in the middle of a run, we'll get them in through the day. That interchangeable thing, and it's different and within different art forms, but we're lucky that we're working within a live form, so we can do that. So really, yeah, I guess making sure that people really know they have power in that space to pull the plug if necessary is important.
Yeah, that's come up actually before in one of our sharing space sessions around consent and how it can be given and also removed, and how things are kind of presented and represented, and yeah, I think that's a really great point that you make there as well, about the difference between knowing something because you've read it or because somebody's told you it, and feeling empowered to act on that thing, like to actually say, I'm not comfortable with this anymore. So, and that does, the other thing I'm thinking about when you're talking there, Nadia, is you have a really good handle on where your responsibility can lie and where the boundaries of that are. Obviously, you can't stop the external factors that might impact how somebody feels about what they've done in a co-creation process. You can't, change the whole world as much as we would love to. Mm-hmm. But you can prepare people for what might come out of that. Yeah.
I think especially if the work is, going to experience a level of profile that they might not be used to or might not have expected. Like when we were making Crackle Dust, I didn't expect it to get the attention that it did, and there was a lot of media interest, and it came during the process as well, as often does. So I was, co-creating this work and then having TV in during rehearsals, and like managing all of that was a bit of a head bug. Like it was really tough. So I think there's something in also preparing yourself as an artist and as a holder of that responsibility for things that might happen. Snowballs do occur.
Yeah. And you also, one of the pieces that I want to, or one of the areas that you've worked with that you touched on earlier that I was really keen to hear a bit more about was you have made work that deals directly with grief. Like grief has come up in your work before, and obviously as this is a memorial programme, grief is a big theme, a big concept that people are, and a big, experience that people have been through. How has co-creation helped you navigate or deal with grief? How has it come up in those sorts of projects?
I think, thinking about the shows I co-created, they've actually all been about grief in some way. And what has happened during the creation of Grief Floats is that it's just become very easy to name that because other people are able to. So it's really started to, I guess, bring to the front all of the not so obvious experiences of grief that we experience. I'm dealing with my own grief of being removed from my Pakistani culture and growing up in a time where it hasn't been possible to visit, and, you know, all of those things. And there are lots of other versions that have come through the work. I think it's really highlighted, and certainly not in any experience I've had, that we're not taught how to grieve, and I know there's not a version of how to, but there's also not one way to make pasta, right? Like there's no conversation growing up about how to do that. And I think grief is certainly something that I remember feeling at the age of 6, you know, very, very young. So I think it's brought all of that forward, all of the different kinds of grief, all of the things that we grieve for, times we grieve for, people we grieve for, but also that there's a real resistance to it as well, and a real, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's such a problem that we don't talk so much about grief. And I remember in my research reading about all of the ways in different cultures that we would really make it visible that we were grieving, whether that's in South Asian culture, you wear white, or, you know, with an armband in Victorian Western culture. And we don't tend to do that anymore. And it's just such a thing to walk around with. And there's no visible way of letting the world know that you need a little bit of a different interaction that day, or that you know, you might not be who you were 3 months ago to expect that difference. So I think the need for that has really come up, you know, people not wanting to keep talking about it and to apologize for their behavior or their sharpness sometimes, or impatience, or whatever that is. And I think it's also really, yeah, it terrifies me actually how much we're all walking around with so much grief and nobody's talking about it. Like it just makes me really scared of what's going to happen in 5 to 10 years time, which is one of the reasons I think, you know, this project is so incredible and such a scale as well, and really, really crucial. But I do think there's going to be a lot of unprocessed grief that is just floating around in the ether. And I think one of the things we work with in Grief Floats, well, we work with water, ritual, movement, and grief, and how all of those things speak to each other, live together, sometimes are divorced from each other. And for some people, they can very easily make the link between water and healing and their grief. And then for some people, they'll be remembering something and they'll say, oh yeah, I haven't thought about it like that, or I haven't. So there's also this lack of interrogation of our own thoughts, because we I don't know if it is so much that we don't want to sit in that and live in that, but also there's this cultural kind of whisper in our ear at all times of moving on. And I don't think you do move on. I think it's, you know, it's really not, it's not helpful, because it's just incorrect. Nobody really moves on from grief. We just live differently and breathe differently. And yeah, I feel like I just rambled a lot, sorry.
No, not at all. Because when you were talking, I was thinking about the different shapes of grief that I have felt personally, and one is definitely very relevant to that project, that Glory project, because I was in a process of grieving the change in my life and the change in my body, and the fact that I was, you know, coming to terms with a condition that's going to affect me forever, you know, and but that was like a sort of long, stretched out process that didn't have this kind of like very pronounced sharp moment that perhaps the loss of a loved one does, but it definitely was grief, so there was a different shape to it. And then, and I've talked about this on a conversation with our storytelling associate, Adil, who's here. I've mentioned that my brother passed away just before the pandemic, and I know what that grief felt like as well. And I really recognise what you're saying about, you know, it almost feels like you have a big badge on your head that says, you know, I think for months I opened conversations with, yeah, my brother died, because I just felt like I was behaving so strangely, and is probably one of the reasons why I was attracted to working on this program in the first place. But yeah, I think there's a real kind of power to creating environments where that can be shared, where it can be recognised, where it can be felt out. And I think, yeah, you're right, that there's also a resistance to it. You know, we don't want to be vulnerable, we don't want to be grieving, we want to be like, you know, consistent and you know, able all the time. But actually life happens outside, you know, these things are always going on in the background. I'm conscious of time and making sure that we have enough time for people to sort of reflect on what we've chatted about, but can I maybe finish up with two questions? One is, what do you wish your partners, funders and colleagues knew about what co-creation needs? And the other is, what are the most important things that you've learned?
Okay, time.
Yeah, time, always time. Yeah.
but really, and I know like any artist will say that in any process, but I think I'm really trying to shift my co-creation process so that it has much more of a long burn at the beginning, so that I can be in spaces with people for, you know, 6 months to a year before there's a nugget of something that we think might be a show. And I think some of that's about me trying to shift forward when people come into the process with me even further. But I think also it just takes time to get to the good stuff, you know, and to the stuff that feels urgent. Sometimes it's not the first thing that comes out of our mouths, the stuff that's urgent. So yeah, time without pressure of an outcome in the beginning. I think that's going to be more and more needed whilst we try to find ways to articulate what's going on for us that we've never had to find before. So yeah, a year's heads up would be lush.
I mean, yes, always looking for more time. I guess I'm also curious about how do we make or create more time, and I wonder about journaling, you know, those practices that you talked about earlier, and how they can create time for us because they create spaces for a different kind of reflection.
Yeah, and I think so one of the things, I'm conscious of time as well, but just because it's relevant, one of the things we're doing with Grief Floats over the next 8 months is about 60 workshops with Grief Floats creative team without any outcome needed. So I'll lead 20 workshops that are using movement is a form of healing. Becky Owen, who's our composer, will lead workshops with voice and throat opening. So these are all for people who are experience any flavor, any shape of grief. So that's one of the sneaky ways in which we've just gone, oh, how do we write a funding application that will get them money and have a framework and a way of beginning that isn't about the making of the show, but actually is about just being together in that and trying to heal and find new ways of healing. So I think that's going to help. And then, what was your second question? What have I learned?
What have you learned? Yeah, what are your kind of like big learning points the last year's time as well, perhaps?
That forgiveness also always will find its way into grief somehow. There's always a notion or need of forgiveness somewhere in a grief, whether that's forgiving ourselves, forgiving others, and working how we get to that quicker. And probably the same for the co-creation learning, actually. Like, you know, you're going to get a lot wrong, and just moving to a place of forgiveness as soon as possible whilst applying the learning, I think, is a really useful tool. It's not easy though. I think for me, it's about just leaving any expectations at the door. Expectations on the work, the people, myself. What will be, and what will be made will be the thing that was meant to be made, and the people who are there, the right people, and, you know, really trusting in that and allowing that to take me where it will. I think those are probably the biggest learnings.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Nadia, for sharing your thoughts and your practice.